So one of the challenges that project teams face as they do their risk analysis is to understand what really is the impact of that risk to the project schedule, right? And so there's been some ways we've done that historically, but with Safran Risk, we've introduced a new way, which we think is much more powerful and much more insightful to the project team. So what are we talking about? Well, we'll go ahead and do a risk analysis here, right? So we've done our risk analysis, and we have our distribution graph, which shows us kind of a range of outcomes, right? Standard information we've all seen before and we're comfortable with, right? Historically, the next step we would take is once we understand kind of what the range of outcomes is, we want to then say, well, what are the drivers, right? And so there's a traditional view of drivers, which is done here. We see here, we've taken a little bit of a different spin and brought the risk and the activity drivers together on one screen so you can see that. And while it's insightful, it's often challenging to really explain this in the organization, right? They see this, they see the bars, and they want to put some numbers against this, right? Unfortunately, the best number we have is this correlation metric, right? Because that's really what we're doing here. We're measuring the correlation between either the risk and the project finish or an activity and the project finish, right? And remember, correlation is just a measure of how related are these two items, right? So what we can gather from this is e-communication, this communication risk, is the strongest risk driver. It most likely correlates to, driving the project finish date. But it doesn't give us insight into what is the cost and schedule impact. It just says, yep, it's a driver, right? And organizations struggle with this. I've seen many risk teams and project teams trying to communicate what this chart means to an executive. And the executive kind of focuses in on that number and says, well, 0.65, what does that represent? Is that 65% of the time this is a driver? Is it 65% of the impact? Like they're looking for a way to really quantify that. And so we've been able to think about that. We said, well, what can we do differently? How can we really give teams the insight into what's driving their project schedule and their project cost? And so we did a sensitivity analysis, and we call it sensitivity analysis by exclusion, right? So what you see now is that we're actually running the risk analysis multiple times, right, over and over again. So you can see the power and the speed of Safran Risk right here. In addition, what we've done is every time we run the analysis, we strip out one of the risk, right? So that allows us to isolate the individual impact of that risk. What we're then left with is insight into what is the impact of that individual risk contribution to schedule and cost, right? So on the screen now, I've got kind of our risk baseline view here, right? So that's included all of the risk, right? Much in the same way we just ran the scenario with all of the risk included. That's the same thing. That's our risk baseline, right? So kind of using the same terms from the scheduling world here. The green line represents what happens if we eliminate or mitigate, whatever kind of how we want to phrase that, communication, right? So if we eliminate this risk, we're then able to save this amount of time, right? So we're able to save 336 days and $16,000, right? So immediately we've now got very quantifiable impact into the impact of that risk. We can see that by schedule, so we can see our top schedule drivers, and we can also see that by cost, right? And we see that there's some overlap. There's some differences here as well too, right? So now the team can begin to look at this and say, well, what's really the most important thing we want to prioritize against? Are we more concerned about cost overruns? Are we more concerned about schedule delays? Is it a combination of both? And how do we do that, right? It's information we didn't have before in kind of that legacy view of the drivers, right? It's interesting, but this is way more powerful and way more beneficial, right? This is the type of information that we're then able to save out and expose in project controls dashboards, to expose this information up through the organization to the project controls managers and executives to give them that very keen insight into really what is driving the overall project from a schedule and cost perspective, and give them that quantified impact that they've been looking for, right? We now have very discrete, identifiable impacts in terms of schedule and cost. So that's the benefit of doing sensitivity analysis by exclusion, which is a great new feature of Safran Risk.